Hello, welcome to another lecture. Today, we are going to look at the topic hyperaccumulation of heavy metals in soil and water by plants. So this is our presentation outline. First, we will look at some background. We will look at what soil is. We also look at water, what plants are, what are heavy metals, then what we mean by phytoremediation, what we mean by hyperaccumulation. Then we will look at plants used for hyperaccumulation of heavy metals. We will look at advantages of using plants for remediation of heavy metals. We also look at disadvantages of using plants for remediation of heavy metals. And then we can conclude. Background. The rapid increase in population coupled with fast industrialization growth causes serious environmental problems, including the production and release of considerable amounts of toxic waste materials into the environment. In recent years, public concerns relating to ecological threats caused by heavy metal have led to intensive research of new economical plant-based remediation technologies. Heavy metals are known to be naturally occurring compounds, but anthropogenic activities introduce them in large quantities in different environmental compartments. This leads to the environment's ability to foster life being reduced as human, animal, and plant health become threatened. This occurs due to bioaccumulation in the food chains as a result of the non-degradable state of the heavy metals. Soil pollution caused by metals is somewhat different from air or water pollution because heavy metals persist in soil much longer than in other compartments of the biosphere. The removal and recovery of heavy metals from contaminated media are of great importance in terms of protection of the environment, as well as abatement of heavy metal toxicity. Conventional methods used for reclamation of contaminated soils, namely chemical, physical, and microbiological methods, are costly to install and operate. The long-lasting mining tradition, which dates back perhaps 2,500 years, has left many areas in Ghana and even the entire world with extreme heavy metal pollution, where only specialized plants can survive. Investigations on gold mine tailings in Ghana found elevated to very high concentrations of arsenic, cadmium, mercury, lead, cobalt, and zinc in soil. So soil. Soil is a mixture of organic matter, minerals, gases, liquids, and organisms that together support life. Soils may become contaminated by the accumulation of heavy metals and through emissions from the rapidly expanding industrial areas, mine tailings, disposal of high metal waste, etc. Unlike organic contaminants, which are oxidized to carbon 4 oxide by microbial action, most metals do not undergo microbial or chemical degradation, and their total concentration in soils persists for a long time after their introduction. Water. Water is a substance composed of the chemical elements hydrogen and oxygen and can exist in gaseous, liquid, and solid states. It is one of the most plentiful and essential of compounds. Metals are introduced in aquatic systems as a result of the weathering of soils and rocks, from volcanic eruptions, and from a variety of human activities involving the mining, processing, or use of metals and or substances that contain metal pollutants. The most common heavy metal pollutants are arsenic, cadmium, chromium, copper, nickel, lead, and mercury. Metals can become locked up in bottom sediments where they remain for many years. Plants. Plants are multicellular organisms in the kingdom Plantae that use photosynthesis to make their own food. There are over 300,000 species of plants. Plants have an important role in the world's ecosystems. They produce most of the world's oxygen and are important in the food chain, as many organisms eat plants or eat organisms which eat plants. Plants evolved from aquatic ancestors and have subsequently migrated over the entire surface of Earth, inhabiting tropical, Arctic, desert, and alpine regions. So, what are the types of plants? We have the charophytes. And what are charophytes? These are complex green algae, such as stoneworts, and they are found in freshwater and brackish water. They have cells with chloroplasts, cell walls containing cellulose, and store starch as plants do. So, this is a picture of stonewort. We also have bryophytes, and bryophytes are non-vascular land plants, lacking vascular tissue, which is tissue that transports water and nutrients. They can be found both on land and in water, and common examples of bryophytes are mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So this picture is a moss, this is liverwort, and this is hornwort. We also have the seedless vascular plants. Seedless vascular plants produce embryos that are not protected by seeds. Instead, they reproduce via spores, and they are found in marshes, swamps, humid areas, and rainforests. Members of this group include ferns, horsetails, quillworts. So over here is a picture of a fern. The next picture is that of a horsetail, and then this is quillwort. Gymnosperms. These are conifers and related plants like the ginkgos and cycads. Gymnosperms have naked seeds, but their seeds are not contained within an ovary, as in flowering plants. Instead, their seeds grow on the surface of leaves, or in the case of conifers, modified structures like cones. They are mostly found in temperate forest and boreal forest biomes. The most common example of a gymnosperm is probably the pine tree and its pine cones. And we can see the picture of a pine over here. Angiosperms. These are the flowering plants, and they are the most widespread plants today. They are found in terrestrial habitats. Their reproductive organs are flowers, which have male parts like the stamen and pollen, and female parts like the pistil. So this picture is a sunflower, which is a flowering plant. Rose, and then orchid. So, heavy metals, what are they? 53 elements fall within the category of heavy metal to date, and defined as a group of elements whose densities are higher than 5 grams per centimeter cube. Heavy metals constitute an ill-defined group of inorganic chemical hazards. And those most commonly found at contaminated sites are lead, chromium, arsenic, zinc, cadmium, copper, mercury, and nickel. Heavy metal contamination of soil and water is a widespread problem throughout the world. Heavy metal contaminated soil and water pose an increasing problem to human and animal health. Mechanisms of carcinogenicity has been discussed for metals and classified arsenic, antimony, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, cobalt, lead, nickel, and vanadium are some metals and metalloids that are carcinogenic to humans or considered to be carcinogenic to humans by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Toxic heavy metals cause DNA damage, and their carcinogenic effects in animals and humans are probably caused by their mutagenic ability. Heavy metals can cause oxidative stress in plants, destroy cell membrane integrity, interfere with nutrient uptake, inhibit photosynthesis, and decrease plant chlorophyll. Metal accumulating plants can be used for phytoremediation or phytomining. That's growing plants to harvest the metals. That is phytomining. So this diagram is just showing us sources of heavy metals and then they are cycling in the soil, water, air, organism ecosystems. So in effect, everything ends with humans. Over here you can see industrial products burn full of fertilizers, pesticides. They get into air, soil, and then water. And through the soil, plants are also affected. And once plants are affected, when humans eat these plants, we are also affected. Or when domestic animals eat plants, then humans will also eat these domestic animals. So everything ends with humans. So it should be noted that the content of metals in tissue generally builds up from this left to the right side, indicating the vulnerability of humans to heavy metal toxicity. Effects of heavy metal contamination on soil. Most heavy metals do not undergo microbial or chemical degradation. Why? Because they are non-degradable, and consequently their total concentrations last for a long time after being released to the environment. The presence of heavy metals in soils is a serious issue due to its residence in food chains, thus destroying the entire ecosystem. As much as organic pollutants can be biodegradable, their biodegradation rate, however, is decreased by the presence of heavy metals in the environment. And this in turn doubles the environmental pollution. That is, organic pollutants and heavy metals that's present. There are various ways through which heavy metals present risk to humans, animals, plants, and ecosystems as a whole. Such ways include direct ingestion, absorption by plants, food chains, consumption of contaminated water, and alteration of soil pH, porosity, color, and its natural chemistry, which in turn impact on the soil quality. Heavy metals are transported by runoff from industries, municipalities, and urban areas. Most of these metals end up accumulating in the soil and sediments of water bodies. Heavy metals can be found in traces in water sources and still be very toxic and impose serious health problems to humans and other ecosystems. This is because the toxicity level of a metal depends on factors such as the organisms which are exposed to it, its nature, its biological role, and the period at which the organisms are exposed to the metal. Food chains and food webs symbolize the relationships amongst organisms. Therefore, the contamination of water by heavy metals actually affects all organisms. Humans, an example of organisms feeding at the highest level, are more prone to serious health problems because the concentrations of heavy metals increase in the food chain. So this is also another diagram or picture. So we can find over here some heavy metals: arsenic, cadmium, lead, copper, mercury, chromium, and their effects. If you look at cadmium over here, it affects our bones, liver, kidneys, lungs, tested brain, immunological, and then cardiovascular. If you look at, let's say, mercury over here, it affects our brain, lungs, kidneys, liver, immunological, cardiovascular, endocrine, reproductive system. Likewise, the other listed heavy metals here. So, phytoremediation. The term phytoremediation, where phyto means plants and the Latin suffix remedium meaning to clean or restore. So this refers to a diverse collection of plant-based technologies that use either naturally occurring or genetically engineered plants to clean contaminated environments. Phytoremediation is a low-cost approach for the effective, feasible, and acceptable remediation of metal-contaminated sites. Phytoremediation relies on the ability of certain plants, called hyperaccumulators, to bioaccumulate chemicals. This technology has been increasingly investigated and employed at sites contaminated with heavy metals like cadmium, lead, aluminum, arsenic, and antimony. Phytoextraction. This exploits the ability of plants to remove contaminants from soil or water into the harvestable plant biomass. The roots take up substances from the soil or water and concentrate it above ground in the plant biomass. At the time of disposal, contaminants are typically concentrated in the much smaller volume of the plant matter than in the initially contaminated soil or sediment. After harvest, a lower level of the contaminant will remain in the soil, so the growth or harvest cycle must usually be repeated through several crops to achieve a significant cleanup. So this is also a picture of a plant which is being used for phytoextraction. So if you look at the left side here, initially there are a lot of heavy metal, that's zinc and copper. So the root of the plant was able to extract these heavy metals. And if you look at the next picture, you can see these heavy metals, a lot of them are now in the leaves, with a few of them still remaining in the ground. So when this particular plant is harvested, means another cycle of replanting needs to take place to hyperaccumulate the remaining heavy metals. Phytoremediation continues. So we have rhizofiltration, and this is a process that filters water through a mass of roots to remove toxic substances or excess nutrients. The contaminants remain absorbed in or adsorbed to the roots. This process is often used to clean up contaminated groundwater through planting directly in the contaminated site or through removing the contaminated water and then providing it to these plants in an off-site location. So if you look at the diagram on our right, we have groundwater over here, which has these heavy metals of interest. So once this plant is being introduced, then it starts taking up the heavy metals in the groundwater through the roots into the aerial parts. Over here you have phytovolatilization. That some of the metals are able to volatilize. We have phytodegradation, that degradation of organic contaminants. We have phytoextraction, where these heavy metals get concentrated in the leaves as seen here. And we have the rhizofiltration that we just talked about here. This is absorption and adsorption of pollutants from water. So the roots absorb this one, that is the rhizofiltration. It has to do with the uptake of these heavy metals from groundwater. Hyperaccumulation. What is hyper? Hyper means above, excessive, or over. And accumulation means the acquisition or gradual gathering of something. So when these two are met together, we get the term hyperaccumulation. So if something is hyperaccumulator, what does it mean? So the term hyperaccumulator describes a number of plants that share the ability to grow on metalliferous soils and accumulate extraordinary high amounts of heavy metals in plants, far in excess of the levels found in the soil. So these plants can tolerate the intake of these heavy metals. Some plants might not be able to do that, but we have special plants that can take up these heavy metals, and these are called hyperaccumulators because they're able to take the plants in excess amounts compared to other plants. So three basic hallmarks distinguish hyperaccumulated from related non-hyperaccumulating taxa. One is a strong enhanced rate of heavy metal uptake. 2, a faster root-to-shoot translocation. And 3, a greater ability to detoxify and sequester heavy metals in their leaves. Several gene families are involved in the processes of hyperaccumulation, including upregulation of absorption and sequestration of heavy metals. So it means these hyperaccumulation genes are found in over 450 plant species, including the model organisms Arabidopsis and Brassicaceae. So these hyperaccumulators, or plants that are involved in this hyperaccumulation process, they're able to do this because they have special genes. So once these genes are expressed in them, that's when they're able to do or carry out this phenomenon of hyperaccumulation of heavy metals. So it all has to do with the genetics of these plants. The expression of such genes is used to determine whether a species is capable of hyperaccumulation. Expression of hyperaccumulation genes provides the plant with capacity to uptake and sequester metals such as arsenic, cobalt, iron, copper, cadmium, lead, mercury, selenium, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, and nickel in 100 to 1,000 times the concentration found in sister species or populations. Metals hyperaccumulation and tolerance, as we already said, are genetically inherited traits. Criteria for selecting plants for hyperaccumulation of metals. 1. The levels of tolerance with respect to metal known to exist at the site. 2. The level of adequate accumulation, translocation, and uptake potential of metals. High growth rate and biomass yield. Tolerance to waterlogging and extreme drought conditions. Availability. Habitat preference. Example, terrestrial, aquatic, semi-aquatic, etc. tolerance to high pH and salinity, root characteristics and depth of the root zone. Plants used for hyperaccumulation of heavy metals. Over 500 plant species comprising of 101 families have been reported, including members of the Asteraceae, Brassicaceae, Caryophyllaceae, Cyperaceae, Contamination, Fabaceae, etc. So the first plant that we can use for hyperaccumulation is the sunflower. And sunflower can hyperaccumulate arsenic. Sunflower grows in open fields, plains, dry environments, etc. And is a good hyperaccumulator of arsenic as a heavy metal. Chinese brick fern is also a hyperaccumulator of arsenic, and this is a herbaceous fern native to the tropics and subtropics. It can be found in limestone habitats, concrete structures, and cracks. Willow. Willow is good for hyperaccumulating cadmium, zinc, and copper. Willow has some specific characteristics like high transport capacity of heavy metal from root to shoot and huge amount of biomass production. Willows are found by rivers, streams, and other wet places. Alpine pennycress. It is a good hyperaccumulator of cadmium, zinc, lead, and nickel. Grows in heavy metal enriched habitats, example mine. Can be found in dry hillside, meadows, forest margins, banks, gardens, lawns, pastures, field margins, yards, and bare places. Tomato. This daily vegetable is good when you want to hyperaccumulate chromium. Though chromium is toxic to most plants, but tomato, however, shows some promise of being able to hyperaccumulate chromium. But then also comes with an ethical issue, because we consume tomato, we normally do not use it for this kind of work. That's in terms of hyperaccumulating heavy metals. So there's an ethical challenge here. Indian mustard is a good hyperaccumulator of lead, and it grows in non-wetlands that fills roadside waste areas. Ragweed is a good hyperaccumulator of lead, grows in roadside open radial habitats. Hemp dogbane, good hyperaccumulator of lead, grows in open wooded areas, ditches, hillsides, roadsides, thickets, fields, lake shores, and waterways. Populus. Populus is a genus of 25 to 30 species of deciduous flowering plants in the family Salicaceae, native to most of the northern hemisphere, and is a good hyperaccumulator of lead. The Cotiana genus, that the tobacco plants. The tobacco plant readily absorbs and accumulates heavy metals like cobalt from the surrounding soil into its leaves. So these are different species of the tobacco plant, the cotiana. Allisum betoloni is a good hyperaccumulator of nickel. Sodom alfredi is also a good hyperaccumulator of cadmium. Pelargonium species can hyperaccumulate cadmium, nickel, and lead. Sesbania drummondi can hyperaccumulate lead. Stanleya species can hyperaccumulate selenium. Astragalus species can also hyperaccumulate selenium. Allisum lesbiacum can hyperaccumulate nickel. So, advantages of using plants for remediation of heavy metals. The cost of this method is lower than that of traditional processes, both in situ and ex situ. The possibility of the recovery and reuse of valuable metals by companies specializing in phytomining. It preserves the topsoil, maintaining the fertility of the soil. It increases soil health, yield, and plant phytochemicals. The use of plants also reduces erosion and metal leaching in the soil. Disadvantages of using plants in remediation of heavy metals. Hyperaccumulation is limited to the surface area and depth occupied by the roots. With plant-based systems of remediation, it is not possible to completely prevent the leaching of contaminants into the groundwater without the complete removal of the contaminated ground, which in itself does not resolve the problem of contamination. The survival of the plants is affected by the toxicity of the contaminated land and the general condition of the soil. Bioaccumulation of contaminants, especially metals, into the plants can affect consumer products like food and cosmetics and requires the safe disposal of the affected plant material. When taking up heavy metals, sometimes the metal is bound to the soil organic matter, which makes it unavailable for the plant to extract. Hyperaccumulation is also generally slower than most other treatments. So phytoremediation compared to other treatments is generally a slower process. Environmental conditions also determine the efficiency of phytoremediation, as the survival and growth of plants are adversely affected by extreme environmental conditions, toxicity, and the general conditions of soil in contaminated lands. Conclusions. After going through all this, what are our conclusions? Phytoremediation is initiated all over the globe, and this is considered one of the low-cost novel green technologies. Hyperaccumulation plants or hyperaccumulators are an appealing and economical alternative to current methods of soil recovery. The successful implementation of phytoremediation depends on identifying plant material that is well adapted to specific contaminated sites. So, I throw a question to all of us to ponder over it. And the question is hyperaccumulation the way to restore our contaminated land in any part of the world you find yourself? Do you think hyperaccumulation is the way to restore our lands that have been contaminated with heavy metals? Your guess is as good as mine. So thank you once again for having time for this presentation. I'm most grateful for your time. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more exciting videos in the future. Thank you.